can't lay this to rest before the wreckage is actually found. The only thing that I want to achieve is to get the search going again for the sake of the families left behind. And they finally did.
One of aviation's greatest mysteries could soon be solved with a new search.
That's a 10-year mystery that needs to be solved.
11 years after the disappearance and nearly 7 years after the end of the last organized attempts to find it, the search for Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 is now finally back on. But why now? What has made the Malaysian authorities give the go-ahead for a new search, and maybe more importantly, how come that the company behind the search seems so confident that they have agreed to do this on a no-find, no-fee basis? Stay tuned. A lot of the events and other developments that I cover on this channel are for people with at least a passing interest in aviation. But the mystery and tragedy behind the disappearance of Malaysian Airlines flight MH370 transcends almost every type of interest barrier. Now in this video I'm not going to do a deep dive into all of the details behind the disappearance, since I've already done that over on the Mentour Pilot channel, but for the purposes of clarity, I will need to cover some of the story's most basic facts. It all started on the 7th of March of 2014, when Malaysian Airlines flight MH370 departed from Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia for Beijing in China. As the aircraft took off, there were 239 people on board, and it initially climbed normally for its cruising altitude, heading north through Malaysia and then towards Vietnam. Now there is still some uncertainty about exactly what happened next, but the evidence that we have from the final report as well as from other studies suggests that whatever happened wasn't an accident. Instead, we are likely looking at some kind of deliberate act by someone on board, someone who then potentially continued performing these actions for several hours after the plane's ultimate disappearance from radar. Now the reasons we have for believing that are many. For example, as MH370 passed a waypoint called Igari, its transponder, which helps air traffic control see and identify the aircraft, was switched off. And we know that the signal wasn't simply lost. Someone must have manually switched it off, because for about 37 seconds before it disappeared completely, the transponder stopped transmitting altitude information, but was still working. Now the only plausible way for this to happen is if someone moves the transponder knob to the altitude off position instead of rotating it all the way to standby. Soon after that, the aircraft performed a really sharp left turn, so sharp that Boeing simulations showed that it must have been done without the autopilot, because the autopilot would not have allowed such a sharp bank angle. And the location where this all happened is also highly suspicious. You see, that turn was made just after the aircraft had been handed over to a Vietnamese controller, who was then never contacted by the aircraft. So because this deviation was made between two countries' air traffic control regions, it actually delayed the detection of the disappearance. On top of that, the sharpness of that left turn also meant that the aircraft avoided Thailand's Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADIZ, which was situated very near that same region. Now, had the aircraft entered into that zone without a valid flight plan, it would have attracted attention from Thailand's military air traffic controllers that would have then been able to track it using primary radar. But with this tight turn, the plane avoided the ADIZ, and if any military controller still would have noticed it, it would have seemed just like another airliner departing and going back, most probably to the airport of departure for some reason, a normal diversion. All of this suggests that whoever was in control was intimately familiar with the shape of the airspace in this region and also the way that air traffic control would operate at this time of night. But the biggest factor pointing towards a deliberate action involves the aircraft's satellite communications through a system called Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, or ACARS. Because as the aircraft then flew silently back over Malaysia, a ground station tried to send a routine ACARS message to the aircraft. But this signal was never acknowledged, indicating that the system on board the aircraft wasn't working. Now, if ACARS simply failed to receive the message, the link with the satellite would still take place and would communicate the fact that ACARS wasn't working. And if someone had manually logged off ACARS from the plane's cockpit, well, then that log would also have been registered in the log file. Without any such message, the only way for the signal to go unanswered would be a power failure in the aircraft. Now that could have happened, of course, but just over 20 minutes after that unanswered ACARS message, that same SATCOM system then woke up again and sent a log-on request to the satellite. So how was that possible? How was the system left without power temporarily? Well, ACARS can be powered by multiple sources for redundancy, so starving it from electricity isn't actually that straightforward. The Boeing 777 has a primary and a backup generator on each engine, and any of them can power this system. This information, by the way, all comes from an incredibly detailed study done by a group of very experienced Boeing 777 pilots, which I'll get back to shortly. Anyway, so the only way to disable ACARS in this way was for whoever did this to first switch off all of these 4 generators. That would still leave the APU, who can also power ACARS, and in the 777 the APU starts automatically if the generators go offline. But that takes some time, and during that time the APU can be stopped from starting if someone manually switches it on and then off again. Now, even in that scenario, the 777 has yet another option for electrical power, the ram air turbine, or RAT, which generates enough power for the plane's critical systems like the flight displays, its fly-by-wire controls and its navigation systems. But that doesn't include things like the autopilot or satellite communication. So, as you can see, achieving this blackout would have been very complicated, and the later return of the ACARS systems told the investigators a couple of different things. Firstly, it made it extremely unlikely that some kind of other catastrophic electrical problem had been the cause of the halted satellite communications. And also, when the aircraft system logged onto the satellite again later, it lacked any valid company and flight IDs, which suggests that someone definitely had manually stepped in and stopped the ACARS system from the cockpit. But what that person had missed was that the removed flight ID didn't stop the satellite communications system from still establishing a link with the satellites. And that caused messages to come and go forth and back once an hour or so, just to verify that the link was still there. Now, these connections are usually called handshakes, which I'm sure you've heard of before, and there were 7 of them in total after the aircraft disappeared, with the first and the last of them being what's known as log-on requests to the system. Obviously, the timing of these handshakes told investigators that this aircraft was still airborne for hours after that air traffic controllers had lost contact with it, but as I'm sure many of you know, they also allowed the investigators to work out much more information. But none of this is really new, so what new information, if any, is making a search for the aircraft more interesting now? Well, depending on where you get your news, you might actually be hearing different takes on this. I'll dig into this deeper in a bit, but some sources are mainly focusing on the advancements in search technology, while others are questioning whether another attempt will yield any real answers at all. And this, the difference in perspectives, is exactly why I use today's sponsor, Ground News, since it helps me to cut through all of the noise in order to see the full picture. And you can follow along as well, just use ground.news/mentor. As you know, the world that we live in just keeps getting more and more polarized, making it harder and harder to find reliable news sources, and the story about MH370 is certainly no exception. As you can see here, over 100 sources worldwide have reported on this story, and out of those, 38% comes from media conglomerates, and almost 18% are government-owned. And that could mean that the way that this story is framed could differ quite a lot depending on where you're reading it. Now, comparing the coverage is really quite interesting. Left-leaning Punch newspapers goes more into the emotional weight of the search, while the right-leaning Daily Express emphasizes more sensational language like mystery solved and perfect hiding place. And if you choose the Vantage plan, you can also access the My News Bias feature, which shows your own reading biases, and that could help you look at other news outlets and thereby get a more fair picture of what's going on. But try it out yourself. Just scan this QR code or head over to ground.news/mentor. Right now, Ground News are giving my viewers an awesome 40% discount on their unlimited access Vantage plan. that's only $5 per month, which is a great deal. But it's only available for a short while, so go get it now. Thank you, Ground News. Now back to the story. The first search for MH370 began as soon as the aircraft disappeared and initially lasted for nearly 3 long years. It was then finally suspended in January of 2017, and by then only 2 small pieces that were believed to come from the aircraft had been found. The only reason those parts were found was because they had been washed ashore in South Africa and on Rodrigues Island in Mauritius, and during the years that then followed, about 30 more items believed to have come from the flight were found in Africa, Madagascar and other areas on the west side of the Indian Ocean. Now, Ocean Infinity, the company that have now just restarted the search for MH370, is actually doing so for the second time now. They first searched for the aircraft between January and June of 2018. Ocean Infinity is a high-tech company that specializes in collecting high-resolution seabed data using a fleet of dedicated vessels along with remote or robotic boats and underwater vehicles. Their customers normally include research groups, energy companies that drill for fossil fuels or install offshore wind turbines, as well as communication companies that lay cables on the seabed. On top of that, they have also conducted deep-sea searches after other accidents. Like back in 2019, Ocean Infinity, for example, used 4 autonomous underwater vehicles, or AUVs, to search for the Stellar Daisy, a South Korean supertanker who sank in bad weather back in 2017. And that search was ultimately successful. Now, a key metric to keep in mind here is speed. By using multiple small vehicles simultaneously searching and mapping the ocean floor, Ocean Infinity claims to be able to cover very large areas very fast. The last time the company searched for MH370, back in 2018, they were initially supposed to cover an area of 25,000 square kilometers, or about 9,650 square miles. But they actually ended up covering over 112,000 square kilometers, or 43,240 square miles. For reference, that's a bit less than the landmass of the state of New York, or about the size of Bulgaria if you're in Europe. So, in just 3 months, the company was able to cover almost the same area as the first search had been doing for 2.5 years, which is pretty incredible if you think about it. Since then, Ocean Infinity has also been expanding and improving its resources, and that in itself is a pretty good argument for the search to be restarted. The new contract between Ocean Infinity and Malaysia, who is still responsible for the investigation, reportedly has a duration of 18 months. Now that's a lot of time for a company that has already demonstrated that it can search enormous areas relatively quickly. But as I said in the beginning of the video, this is on a no-find, no-fee contract. Ocean Infinity will get $70 million if they find the aircraft, but if they don't, well then they don't get a dime for their troubles. So in addition to their reputation, they're also having a lot of financial skin in the game here, since keeping a fleet of ships and remote vehicles in the South Indian Ocean for 1.5 years is not exactly going to be cheap. With that in mind, let's have a closer look at how the search for MH370 in the vastness of the Indian Ocean was conducted the first time around, and what has changed since. Like I mentioned earlier, after the aircraft systems re-established communications with the satellite, it then made 7 handshakes, which you probably would have seen in maps represented as 7 concentric arches drawn at irregular radii. So what do these arches actually mean? Well, you can think of each of these signals as a bit like a GPS. Well, at least sort of. Malaysian Airlines was using an Inmarsat satellite for the ACARS and other satellite communications of its aircraft, and we know the precise time when each of the signals was sent out by the satellite. And we also know how long it normally takes for the aircraft to respond after it receives the signal. The actual response time then depends on the distance between the aircraft and the satellite, and the difference between the expected time of the arrival of the return signal and its actual time of arrival is known as the burst timing offset, or BTO. In the case of the GPS receiver in your phone or other devices, your phone is using similar timing information from 3 or usually many more satellites to draw 3 or more circles on the Earth's surface, and where those circles kind of meet each other, well, that's where you are. Now, Obviously, I'm oversimplifying things here, but the point is that the Inmarsat handshakes between the plane and the satellite effectively can work like a GPS connection with just one satellite. So since we know the exact position of the satellite, we can therefore also say that at the precise moment when each handshake was made, well then the aircraft was somewhere along the corresponding circle or arc. Now the reason we can exclude a big portion of each circle to have an arc instead has to do with the fact that we're dealing with a known vehicle, a Boeing 777-200ER, which obviously has some practical, real-world limitations on how fast and how far it can fly. So from quite early on in the search, investigators realized that they could narrow down the search quite significantly thanks to these data points. So the focus of the initial investigation turned to the southern side of the arc, because there are plenty of radars that could have spotted the aircraft if it had turned to the north instead, and there was no trace of it there. With time, investigators then also got even more information out of their data. In addition to the BTO, there is also something called a burst frequency offset, or BFO, which tells us how the aircraft was moving in relation to the satellite during each handshake, because of a slight change in the frequency of the signal. You can think of this like the noise of an ambulance siren, which seems to get lower in tune as the ambulance drives past you and then away from you. This is called the Doppler effect, and traditional radars use this phenomena to determine an aircraft's speed. But in case of MH370, since the satellite was way up in space, that BFO information instead can tell us whether or not the aircraft was climbing or descending during each handshake. Again, there is much more to all of this, and other clues about this flight's pilots, which I covered over in my full video, which you should definitely check out if you haven't. But the point is that investigators and others with access to this information have been studying the possible flight paths that the 7 fixed arch handshakes can follow, in order to narrow down the possible search area. And they have also found some new information to add on to the handshakes. I have already mentioned one pilot study, the extremely detailed work by Captain Blelly and Jean-Luc Marchand, who dove into the systems and procedures used by Boeing and Malaysian Airlines in order to get the best out of the clues that we already have. The other study that I mentioned in my video is by Richard Godfrey, an avionics systems engineer who has constructed a series of studies involving something called the Weak Signal Propagation Reporter, or WSPR protocol. Now this is something that was originally started by an astrophysicist, Professor Joseph H. Taylor Jr., who also happened to be a keen amateur radio enthusiast. He developed WSPR as a way for radio enthusiasts to test how radio transmissions made at different frequencies propagate over very large distances. But it also turns out that these signals can be affected temporarily when they encounter an obstacle in their path, which causes anomalies in that signal. And more importantly for this context, this data from hundreds of different radio transmitters is then logged on an online WSPR database. And that means that it can be analyzed retrospectively, weeks, months, or even years after the fact. And there is data in that database going all the way back to 2008, well before MH370 was lost in 2014. Now, I want to be absolutely clear here to say that there are quite a few WSPR skeptics out there, and it is certainly true that WSPR was not developed as a method of tracking aircraft or other flying objects. But having said that, there are passive radars out there who are actually designed to detect the aircraft using existing radio transmissions in a given region. But Richard Godfrey, the avionics engineer who has been developing algorithms that allows him to use WSPR this way, has also used it to track other aircrafts with known flight paths, including Boeing 777s. And WSPR generates new signals every 2 minutes, potentially therefore providing many more data points to study. Now, most conventional studies, including that of Captain Blelly and Marchand, assume that MH370 followed a more or less straight heading as it made its way down south. And that is a perfectly reasonable assumption to make, since everything else in this flight suggests that whoever was in controls of the aircraft wanted to escape detection. But Godfrey's WSPR data shows something different. In his model, the aircraft also travels south, but doesn't move in a straight line at all, possibly in an attempt to stay clear of busy airways, which actually also speaks of someone trying to avoid detection. The Whisper data also corresponds well with the 7 handshakes, and near the end of its path, the data suggests that the aircraft briefly flew in what looks like a figure 8 pattern at around the time when it would be running out of fuel. If that happened, it could indicate that whoever was in control was looking below for ships or any other type of traffic that could pinpoint the touchdown of the aircraft before it disappeared under the waves. Now, since I made the video about this over on the Mentour Pilot channel, Godfrey has also published a newer study, comparing his team's estimate of the final resting place of MH370 with 2 new data points taken from the home computer of Captain Zahir Shah, the pilot who was in command of flight MH370. Now, if you look at this, the line in blue joins these 2 data points, which represented a simulated flight that the captain did on his home simulator. And as it turns out, this line passes straight through the area where Richard's Whisper data indicated that MH370 made its figure 8. Now, if that is indeed true, it would definitely lend some more weight to his investigation. So, where are we right now then? Well, last year, Ocean Infinity proposed a plan for its new search, including effectively 3 different search areas which they plan to start exploring in the fall of 2024. Those negotiations with the Malaysian authorities then dragged on, and in December of 2024 it finally looked like things were moving along and that an agreement was in place, even if the contract hadn't been formally finalized yet. Then in February this year, even though the final contract still hadn't been signed, Ocean Infinity started moving its assets into place, and the search then finally resumed on 26th of February. So what are these areas that the company will be exploring then? Well, as we're recording this, you can actually follow Ocean Infinity's main vessel, Armada 7806, as it makes its way through the Indian Ocean. And I'm going to link to it here in the description and also up here if I manage to figure out how to do it. In orange and red, you can see the old search areas. Then the white lines show the new areas which Ocean Infinity will be looking into right now. And these are the 2 mostly rectangular areas on either side of the already searched area around the 7th arc. The southern one of these 2 rectangular areas mostly overlaps with a triangle in yellow, which represents the new search zone proposed in the study by Captain Blelly and Marchand. Further north we see a white jagged area, denoting a smaller search area which corresponds perfectly with Richard Godfrey's study. Again, these are places that we know that Ocean Infinity wants to search and Malaysia's investigators have approved. And I can't tell you how happy this makes me. Again, I'm not trying to debate who is right or wrong here. The point for me, and I'm sure everyone else who's been working tirelessly to try to, come up with solutions to this mystery, is that we needed to restart the search and hopefully bring an end to one of aviation's greatest mysteries once and for all. I really hope that we will soon learn more about this and that they will actually find the aircraft so that the families of the victims of this tragedy will finally get the answers that they have been waiting for 11 long years already. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you are watching Mentour now. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.